Elena is adopted by individuals and organisations that seek to make excellence a habit. She returns this year to CUBO to build on her provocation and invitation that we perform with impact by inviting us to practice challenging change. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Elena Antonacopoulou. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I'm absolutely thrilled to be welcoming you to my home, to my university. Welcome. And thank you for welcoming me back. I'm deeply touched when people receive me and remember some of the ideas that I share. And I don't know whether crying is what I'm going to aim for, but I will promise you that I want to touch as many of the nerves that prompt you to act by the end of this session. And it's a very important moment for me to be returning, because there are many things that I would really be inviting you to pay attention to as I take you through this presentation. And it's just as much the ideas that I'm sharing, which I'm choosing this as a special moment to share some literally cutting-edge ideas I will be presenting at the House of Lords on Tuesday. And for me, you matter more than them. And that's why I'm choosing to share this with you first. I think the second important point is the thing that I am, if nothing else, about when I promote Gnosis is the idea that we light up with knowledge. That ideas is what we fundamentally depend on. And ideas and the knowledge that we derive when we put those ideas to use, when we act knowledgeably, and when we develop, in my case, actionable knowledge, is when we see this wonderful music I call zzz, zzz, happen. That's energy. And the energy lights up our capacity to act and make a difference. So today, I want to pick up where we left last time. Because every time we take a step forward, we first have to take a step back. And we need to do that because today we're going to understand more why crisis and change go together. Because crisis is one of those beautiful words, I will explain how I've engaged with it over the years, that allows us to see the coexistence of opportunity and challenge. So that we don't have to see it as either or, but both and more. And it is this fundamental connection that I want us to highlight and explore more. And then, of course, I really do think, having spent the last 23 years of my life preaching, you might say, executives on leadership programs, on MBA programs about change and change management and leading change, I can tell you one thing I've come to appreciate more than anything else, aside from the fact, of course, that there is no one single formula as to how you lead change effectively. The most fundamental aspect in engaging with change is changing the way you engage with change. Seriously. Because the only thing there is change. Stability is the exception. And thank God that is the case. Otherwise, we wouldn't be alive. So the first thing I want you to celebrate today is that we are where we are because of change. And we are here in this conference to renew our capacity to take change the way it matters to us most. So we shouldn't be seeing ourselves as victims. And I want to introduce you to a learning mode that I have been developing through my research over the years, and which I have been applying in a number of different settings, and which I can see is having the effect that it's designed to. Touch people, provoke them, allow them to grow by moving them, propelling them, energizing them to make connections in order to define the future they want to be part of. What is my thesis today? The unexamined life is not worth living. That is what Socrates said, and that is what Plato wrote in his Apology. And being Greek, I don't have to apologize for that in saying that. I can apologize for many things you read and see in the press, even if it's not my fault, because it is, I'm afraid, another instance of poor judgment. But the examined life, as earlier speakers have alluded to, is about building that capacity to feel safe being vulnerable in asking ourselves of the hard questions. And I have a few questions to ask you today. So, a bit of a health warning. Every time you see me highlight this little bar, it's a reminder, focus, and see the connection. Because I'm going to cover quite a big ground here. And I can't attend to all the particularities of the context that is so unique to each of you. So I need you to do some of the work. Otherwise, I wouldn't be testing you later to see what you've learned. Okay, let's take that step back. Paige this morning said to me, "Are you going to make me cry?" And you touched my heart, Paige. Thank you for saying that. Because there is no bigger reward for anyone who's dedicated in learning and supporting others to do so, to know that you've moved somebody, even if it was by showing them a very real and a very pragmatic picture of what happens to all of us. I'm not going to repeat the video, because my purpose is not to, I guess, have you relive the experience. But I do want to bring you back to that moment of what prompted you to express that sheer feeling that filled you such that you would cry. And that feeling, I argue, is that you touched not your heart, not your logic, but your gut. That's when all your senses come together and you become conscious. And conscientious, by the way, too. So, what did we say last time? I showed you this story of an unknown, to this day, anonymous teacher in New York who wanted to acknowledge her students at the end of the year for making a difference to her. I mean, that is a gesture of gratitude, is to be applauded. Hint, hint, how many of you say thank you to your team? How many of you make people great? I'm so proud of you. How many of you make a point of making people feel valued for being who they are? If you're not doing enough of it, do more of it. Because the effect of it, as we've seen in that video, is that each student receiving a ribbon which says who you are makes a difference, and inviting each student to take 3 more ribbons that they can hand to others, became what I referred to the Olympics of organizing. You know, a baton relay where the handing of the baton was a recognition, an acknowledgement for being who you are. So the idea was that each student would receive these 3 ribbons and would go and hand them to people who made a difference to them. And one of the students handed it to a junior manager where he had an internship. And he gave him the 2 other ribbons and said, give one to someone that you valued, and ask them to give the last one to somebody they value themselves. And so the junior manager honored and gave one of the ribbons to his boss. And he said, this is the experiment, and this is kind of the exercise, and I want to acknowledge you and thank you for being my boss. And the boss went home, and he gave the ribbon to his son. And this is where I choke. Because I have a 14-year-old son. And I wouldn't imagine contemplating what that father endured that night. To acknowledge that that became the prompt of him saving his son from suicide. Okay. I speak to you from here when I say this. And I feel that feeling because I'm waking up, and I hope I'm waking you up, to fundamentally one key priority. We are all professionals. We are all extremely good at who we are, otherwise we would not reach these senior levels. We are also, though, parents, daughters, sisters, brothers, husbands, wives. We are human. And it is that humanity we leave out of the door more often than not when we enter our offices. So, what this experience did for this manager, as the video is trying to suggest, is that he became a changed man. Okay, so if I zoom on that, I want to encourage you to acknowledge that changing is down to us. Change doesn't just happen because of climatic conditions that are entirely out of our control. We make change, and change will affect us. So if you are leading change in your organizations, think about what commitment to your personal degree of change you are making first. Why did I show you that video? Because if we were talking about performing leadership with impact, I wanted us to realize the impact we have on each other, but also realize your impact. Give more, because performing is an act of giving. And you can make a genuine difference by being who you are, which is also, I wanted you to recognize that who you are and your impact is our impact. So why am I so happy to be here with you today? Because there wouldn't be a more critical moment in our history in higher education when we needed to join forces to prove to society at large that the idea of the university is as alive and as critical today as it was in the centuries back then when the notion of learning institutions was being formed. But that idea doesn't depend on me standing and lecturing because I have a title called professor. It makes me the least, sort of the more challenged one to continue to learn all the time. As previous speakers were also alluding to, this is about us connecting together to create experiences of learning from which everybody that participates in them grows. And it is that notion of growth I want to tackle today. Because I invited you to see impact, the way at least I define it, as the improvement of action. And because I know in the world of business, we always talk about innovation. We all talk about growth. We measure economic performance as evidence of growth. I want to remind you that there is more to it than that kind of growth. And the reason, the connection with the 14-year-old person in the video I showed you who was due to commit suicide, and the reference to my 14-year-old is because we owe it to the future generation to hand them a baton that will allow our universe to continue to grow and the possibilities to sustain ourselves, to foster that. So what do I mean when I talk about growth? Okay? And there is no model, but there are various modes of growing. And I think we sometimes forget the variety. I want to speak briefly of growing up, growing together, and growing others. And just so that you know that I can make you laugh just as I can make you cry, I want you to see this and think about what you wanted to do
when I grow up. I want to file all day.
I want to claw my way up to middle management, be replaced on a whim.
I want to have a brown nose. I want to be a yes man.
Yes, woman. Yes, sir. Coming, sir.
Anything for a raise, sir.
When I grow up,
I want to be underappreciated.
be paid less for doing the same job. I want sunshine blowing up my dress.
Okay, oops. That definitely didn't suppose the feature. So what did you want to become when you were growing up? So here's another version of how growth happens, at least if we notice. Okay, and honestly, I don't know what it's I mean, last time I had a difficulty keeping you focused by talking about the elastic bands, and I've just literally lost mine. Remember that when you came in? Oh, good, okay. Right, so that's growing together. And what allows us to grow together as we grow up ourselves in our families, in our communities, in our organizations, is to remain connected. But what happens when we try to grow others? I like this.
Thanks.
It's what FedEx likes to think they're doing.
FedEx has solutions to enable global commerce that can help your company grow steadily and quickly.
谢谢大家。
Cut it out.
Okay, right. So, does this help us understand what I mean by growth in at least the multiple ways that it's taking place, and certainly not in the limited ways that bottom line and target focuses in measuring performance and therefore measuring and understanding growth limit us in our understanding? I would argue to you today that we are challenged as an important profession in society to grow others. Because we receive young adults at the most fundamental edge of their growth, where they have to form their identity as emerging professionals. Some of us teach them about what professionalism means, but you hold the key in sustaining their natural potential in the way they sleep, in the way they interact, as the previous presentation was alluding to. All form part of the student experience, and all form part of all that is important to allow us to continue to change and remain not just relevant, but impactful. So I'm bound to invite you to step for a moment back, given as I'm revising the journey we've come through this far, and ask yourselves, did you do anything differently 1 year on? What are the dangers of doing more of the same? That's an easy one to give an answer to. If you continue to do the same things time and again, you will continue to get the same results. You will not grow. And what will it take a crisis to change? And of course, when I speak to companies about this, I invite them to engage in leadership and in change towards their future by understanding this as a process of strategic organizational learning. And if they can engage themselves in asking questions like, what crisis do we anticipate to be facing in 6, 12, or 24 months? What capabilities and talents in you and your people will you need to have accumulated to respond to the demands of your customers and the challenges of your competitors? And furthermore, what will be your learning strategy individually and organizationally? And perhaps most fundamentally, how will you know it is the right one? Because if you wait for the results, it's already too late. Now, attempts to try and respond to these questions and overcome these ongoing malpractices that seem to place us from one crisis and one degree of disappointment to another across a number of professions is what has led to this major report that I've been working for the last few months with a major think tank called Respublica. And just to add another bit of a joke, this Respublica think tank has been launched by David Cameron, is led by Philip Blond, which, as fortune would have it for me, is the stepbrother of Daniel Craig. So you can see my motivation. So we have a private joke at home that mom is working with Mr. Blonde, but she'd rather be working with Mr. Bond. So on a serious note, what we did was we looked at some fantastic research that the Jubilee Center in the University of Birmingham have been pursuing, looking into the character and values and virtues of practitioners in the teaching, law, and medicine professions. We took that research and extended it, drawing on some other research that I and others have been doing, and we produced this report, which we are launching next week in the House of Lords. I can't go into great detail, but I can tell you there are some bold recommendations. And I feel more humble than I ever have to have seen my work transform to policy level. So I wanted to share with you what we are going to be telling them, to invite you as a professional body and as professionals to think why this is an important opportunity for you to grasp the future you can create for yourself. Because any process of change is about letting go. It is about embracing the unknown. And that is often why we equate it with crisis. But the crisis of the professions we face today is one of persistent failings in many professional services. It is also the diminishing trust because professions and professionals receive continuously bad publicity, and also the evidence of ongoing misconduct, which is threatening the confidence in and high regard to one's health professions and professionals delivering public service. And what we find is that the teaching, law, and medicine professions are still highly trusted by comparison to politicians, journalists, and bankers. So of course I'm bound to ask you, are CUBO senior managers as professionals with responsibility for residential portfolio, catering and retail operation, conference facilities, which also encapsulate business and leisure and tourism, trusted by the students and their parents, the visitors, the suppliers, others? I like the penny dropping moment. Think about it. Because as we invite professionals across different professions to think about how to overcome the crisis, we have to wake them up to the fact that competence alone cannot guarantee professional conduct. That capability developed through experience cannot guarantee capacity to deal with uncertainty. And that codes of ethical conduct, which I have checked, you seem to not have one, which is interesting in itself, they themselves alone cannot guarantee the capacity to deal with the unknown. So what fundamentally we need to revisit is this pool of oscillations. Someone referred to it as a tsunami. I'd like to think about it as the process of making wave when we look at our core, and our core as professional is our conduct. And our conduct spills over in our competence, capability, and capacity to make a difference. Which is also, when we look at our impact, why it is so important to look what the public or the users of the services that we provide do look for. And what we find consistently across studies, across professional services, is that users of services look for consistency, reliability, and fairness. And moreover, it's not so much the service you receive that matters, or the product that you buy, but the relationship that you form. So we are moving beyond the notion of personalization of medicine or service towards the humanization of those services. And I'm asking you to just spare a thought of how that Chinese student who is coming to spend a year with not being able to speak very much our language feels when they can't taste their food the way they used to, when they don't have that sense of comfort that we all would understand and associate with the degree of safety that a home provides. So this idea that the relationship would provide reliable care is what allows us to appreciate more fundamentally than anything else that the crisis in professional life is one of recognizing the vulnerability of users and the perceived usefulness of our services and the impact that these have to social well-being. So how we tackle this crisis is by recognizing that at the core of it is what we can refer to as the virtue gap. The relational disengagement between professionals, and the users and citizens in realizing the impact to social well-being. And I think effectively these values in use is an important proposition, which is about acknowledging that it's not just having a list of wishful thinking or taking vows, or indeed taking an oath, which some bankers now are invited to take, and the legal profession are actually gearing in the same direction, that matters. But it is how do we live those values? Because what fundamentally this invites us to think again is that we've chosen this vocation, not job, not occupation, but this vocation because of who we want to become as a person. And we forgot halfway through what becoming a person means, what growing to become human entails. And that is also why the ideal professional, be they doctor, lawyer, or teacher, is defined by other professionals in the same professional bodies with reference to their character strengths and virtues, not their qualifications. And of course, I'm very lucky to be doing some work with the Royal Norwegian Air Force Academy. And I'm telling you how humbled I am to see how in the military context, the translation of values to virtues gap is addressed through a set of moral principles, axioms that exemplify and become agreed upon obligations. This is where we see the birth of the ultimate virtue, which I call altruism. But to reach the point of altruism, you need to first work on practicing making the right choices and using your judgment well. So I invite CUBO as a professional body, representing professionals, realizing its impact in the sustainable growth of higher education in the UK. And I invite also CUBO as a professional body to guide its members through the moral maze of professional practice. Because if you don't have support for that, then it's like asking you to tell me what you do, how you do it, and why you do it in the way you do it, and you not being able to answer that. So I won't test you this time. I'll save it for next time. So, in this process of supporting organization-wide, institutional-wide change, where our impact becomes the drop that really creates all these oscillations of possibility. How we learn to make waves becomes critical. So I'm going to tell you the three most important things you need to take away from today. Practice, practice, practice. I've done 8 years of research with musicians, performing artists, with doctors, with chefs, with athletes. All of them share practicing as a core aspect of performing their practice. And all of them will tell you that they've been practicing a lot by repeating routines to develop technical capability. They've also been practicing to reflect and improve on specific skills, specific capabilities, where they have strengths and weaknesses on. But what excels them is their capacity to practice at the level where they step out of themselves and what they do, to be able to examine what they do with fresh eyes, to renew themselves. So, you said in the beginning, I'm returning, but I'm not returning just to reiterate your routines, okay? I'm returning to invite you to review what you do and to renew who you can become. So how am I going to try and do that? By inviting you to understand what practicing entails. And often we tend to divide or create dichotomies between thinking on the one hand and action on the other, and forgetting the space in between, right? And that is often why we feel so stretched, right? Between thinking and doing. And in our busy lives, because busyness is the disease of the 21st century in the world of business and elsewhere, we get stretched and stretched and stretched until we break down. Okay, instead of stretching our capacity to be flexible, agile, resilient, resistant to breakdown, to crisis. So this capacity to turn tensions into extensions lies at the core of this new learning theory that I have, or the learning mode that I'm developing, in order to review breakdowns, understand and distance yourself from the limitations of seeing breakdowns as negative, because our biggest growth comes from those mistakes than perhaps our successes, and use those reflexively in order to create new breakthroughs. So I'm going to show you how I'm attempting to do it, and I'm delighted that Catherine gives me the opportunity to run a workshop, so I'm only going to give you a taster here. So what are the risks of not practicing? Bottom line, confusion. You lose the sense of clarity, you're blurred in your capacity to see things, and you see the world as complex and complicated. When complex means interconnectivity and complicated means you don't know which are the woods and which are the trees. And the reason why we get blurred is precisely because our confidence is in doubt. We're not sure we can do it. And this doubt around our capacity to act is what paralyzes our capacity to act well. That's why misconduct is happening. And so, let me tell you what I teach my MBA students, that most of them operate with the typical sweep it under the carpet management style. Because if a mistake has happened, they ask themselves, will it show? If it will, can you hide it? If you can't, conceal it before anyone else finds out, and that way you avoid the problem. If you ask yourself and it will not show, then bury it, and more probably again the problem is avoided, and hopefully nobody will notice. But if you can't hide it, you should ask, can you blame someone else? Can you attribute it to special circumstances? Or maybe even a difficult client? If you can't get in first with your version of events, that way the problem is avoided. If you can't, ask yourself, could an admission damage your career prospects? If it will, sit tight and hope the problem goes away. That way the problem is avoided. That's why the problem will be repeated. But if you can't, get in first again with your version of events. This is a typical human behavior at work. Why? Because we play politics. That's how we understand we should act to cover ourselves. Well, what if we were committing to acknowledging that making mistakes is all part of the capacity to grow? And the reason why I'm taking you back again to what you wanted to become when you grow up, how you are witnessing growth in those you love, and you have a hand in having brought to life and helping grow, even more so than those around you, which are your employees, your colleagues, and so on and so forth. Please understand that it is so critical to celebrate the capacity to learn from failure. I'm working with a big gaming company in Seattle, a young entrepreneur who is referred to as the next Bill Gates, and I are interacting, and I brought some of his games to test with my MSc students this year. And it was a fantastic opportunity to turn around something that we're all loathing, as earlier has been said, technology is making us more isolationist, less attentive, etc., into a positive possibility, because I have to care for supporting the learning of the future generation. And games could become a useful way of engaging people in understanding how they use their judgment. And I can tell you, the only thing that makes me feel better as a mother when I see my children playing on their games is that I know how they deal with failure. Okay? When the game didn't go to plan, they will be angry, but they will go back and try again. How do we deal with failure? We shy away and recover a lot slower. That ain't going to let us grow with the pace of change the world is living. So I invite you to consider the idea of creating learning spaces. Peter Singer referred to it as the learning organization. The idea goes something like this. You've made a mistake, take ownership of the problem and assess the possible consequences. Ask, are the consequences potentially serious? If they are, tell someone immediately. Cooperate fully to correct the error and review the procedures. That way the problem is solved. If the consequences are not serious, then take corrective action and inform those affected. Investigate why the mistake occurred. Understand if there is a flaw in the system. If there is one, share your discovery and improve processes. That way the problem is solved. And if there is no flaw to the system, try to learn from your mistake and avoid repeating the same action again. which makes me even more sensitive in highlighting to you that I'm not contradicting myself when I say return, repeat. I don't mean do the same thing again. Okay? Deleuze said, répétition à différence. Repetition is different. You never end up to the same point again. And you will see why I've taken this as the core of my learning theory. Chris Argyris was my mentor at Harvard, and he is well known for having introduced these learning modes he calls single and double loop learning. Single loop learning is you've taken some action and there was an error. Single loop learning is take this tension and take corrective action. Double loop learning is when you don't just change the action, but you review your underlying values. Because the tension between your values, which allow and filter the way you act, and the learning process will allow you to take better actions in the future. But we've taken this work further since, and we have also promoted the idea that we need to also review and change our learning practices. And I will tell you, in my 23 years as a scholar and a teacher, facilitating learning in organizations and in the classrooms and elsewhere that I teach, the one biggest difficulty and block to change is changing the way we learn. Okay, so our learning practices are one of our biggest obstacles. And that is what's called triple loop learning. But what happens when you put practicing in this process? Practicing basically celebrates all these tensions and connects all these processes with the error, but in a way where it draws all the tensions and the crises in order to inform learning. So, what is the source of the thinking behind learning in crisis as a mode of learning? The Greek word, krisis, crisis, means two things. Crisis, as the Greek would know it these days, is circumstances of emergency and disaster. But the word also means making critical judgments. And that is what I encourage through this learning mode. That basically, learning in crisis is the ongoing practicing in the midst of everyday action. So that I encourage practitioners to search and research what they do, to examine their working lives and lives more generally in ways where they are not afraid to fail and take corrective actions from which to grow. And to do that, and I'm only going to show you this so that you know this is not an idea that was born yesterday. I've been working on this for a good few years. We've only started with a very basic definition that to me, learning is the liberation of knowledge and the organic growth of the individual, which is why I see repetition as so critical in the learning process, and which is also why I distinguish repetition from replication. Okay? More often than not, when we go into standard operating routines, we replicate, we don't repeat. And that's what distinguishes a great violinist or a great athlete from one who just goes through the same modes again and again. Okay, so my question to you then is, how well practiced are you individually in dealing with change and the unknown? How well practiced are your team in dealing with change and the unknown? And how well practiced is the wider institution in dealing with change and the unknown? How much time do I got? Okay. Let me do a quick exercise. I'll leave this for the workshop, so come and find me and then I'll take you through it then. Watch how you see. If I show you this and say change, and then I show you this, and I'm still saying change, does it affect the way you think or feel about change? Okay. Let me then ask you what you see in this picture. Okay, do we all see the same thing? Or do people agree because someone said that that is what we have to see? Okay, when you come to my workshop, you'll understand how communicating black and white or black and white together is more than a number of shades of gray. More than 50. Okay? It is about the capacity to engage with color. So I will get you to see how you see the world differently, because I will show you not just how your left and right brain work, but how the learning crisis you need to endure is what's limiting the capacity for you to imagine the impossible. And as Catherine said to me when I greeted her this morning, these things you organize when you expect the unexpected. Well, that's exactly the right attitude. Because you can have your cake and eat it. Because you can choose to see this as both a single piece of cake or a whole cake with a piece missing. Now, if you manage to do that, you will be noticing how your brain and your focus in your eyes, your capacity to attend to different facts changes to enable yourself to do that. Now, I don't have the time to guide you, but I will have the time, and I'll make it my business to show you how to see differently. And given that I'm also someone who wears glasses, 20/20 vision doesn't exist, so be assured it's not your goal. Okay, so let me finish with a few more things to take away. Fundamentally, I wanted to touch you again today, but touch you on a different level. I didn't want to touch your emotions. I wanted to speak to your voice of conscience as professionals. I wanted to invite you to ask yourselves if you are curious to practice changing the way you change, because that's what's necessary to help our institutions to continue to survive. Change the way we change. I wanted to invite you to ask yourselves if you are committed to making the difference by being who you are. And I wanted to ask you and invite you to reflect if you are ready to realize your impact by unlearning to relearn how you become a man-ager. And I want to remind you that this is part of a major program of work, which I call management, rewriting management as man-agement. Agement means coming of age. It's about the human growth I've been speaking throughout my presentation. And although I'm very Greek in my institutional structures of the Greek temple, it will take something a lot more dynamic than that. So I call this program SOLAR, which is Strategic Organizational Learning Research. And the idea of a solar system is to create the degree of warmth to propel the connections we need to make as we lead things forward, to bring about the personal growth that will deliver the degree of change by learning to think critically, starting from a greater awareness of ourselves, and indeed enhancing our performance in the process. And what can you expect at the end of this process is a drop. And it only takes a drop for the oscillation of the wave to take place. But it is an important drop. It is the vitality of well-being. And I'm delighted that in the university I'm a member of the group of this well-being board, an initiative in order to instigate a collective effort to ensure that we deliver the best for our people. And in case you're asking me why do I drive this agenda forward and why this is so central, because I'm launching this report and I'm challenging professions and professionals and the government to do more to restore trust, to restore professionalism, to restore our capacity to lead change without seeing crisis as a debilitating process in between. Why do I do that? And why I believe in you? Because I believe in being alive. Thank you.